Thank you all for joining us this evening at Darien Library for Broadway and the Book of Genesis with Gil Harel. Stephen Schwartz, whom we were just talking about, is one of the most successful composers in Broadway history, with credits that include Godspell, Pippin, Wicked, and others. His music has earned him many impressive accolades and awards. And although 1991's Children of Eden was not a commercial success, it has gone on, as Gil was saying, to become something of a cult favorite among theater companies. It's loosely based on the Book of Genesis, and the story begins with the creation and initially focuses on Adam, Eve, and their descendants. Gil Harel, as you know, is a musicologist and music theorist whose interests include styles ranging from Western classical repertoire to jazz. Previously, he served on the faculty at Baruch College, and he currently teaches at the Naugatuck Valley Community College, where he was presented with the Merit Award for exemplary service to the college. At NVCC, Gil conducts the college chorale, the a cappella ensemble. He teaches music theory and music history, and serves as the musical director of theater productions. Outside of teaching, he enjoys staying active as a pianist and a vocalist. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by the annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your support to make programs like this, as well as our collections available to the community. I hope everyone's ready to learn a little bit more about this overlooked and underappreciated musical, Children of Eden, and I'll turn the mic over to Gil.
Thank you, Pat, for that excellent introduction. I think you really laid the foundation for the music we're going to dive into this evening. Now, there's a bit of a paradox we talk about Children of Eden. On the one hand, as Pat mentioned in the opening remarks, it's a work that did not experience any initial commercial success. In fact, it was branded by some with the dreaded F word, that is to say, flop. Not to the same degree that Carrie, the musical experience, we talked about Carrie in our last program, but nonetheless, there were, for reasons we'll get into, Children of Eden did not do well in its initial reception. I'm going to talk about why that is, because nowadays, Children of Eden, once again, as Pat mentioned, is indeed something of a cult classic. And that's especially true when it comes to performers and amateur theater companies, and really up to the semi-professional, even up to the equity level. This is a musical that is done very frequently. In fact, Musical Theater International, hereafter referred to as MTI, one of the biggest licensing companies when it comes to selling the rights for performances of works from the canon of Broadway musical theater, lists this as one of the top most frequently requested musicals for licensing. That is to say, it's one of the most frequently performed works in the canon. So how do we square that? Isn't that something of a paradox? How could a work simultaneously have a lukewarm or even a frigid reception, but go on to become such a classic? Well, as Stephen Schwartz himself said it, not with respect to Children of Eden, but with respect to a musical that would go on to become his biggest commercial success by a long shot, and that is Wicked. For those who don't know, Wicked in 2015 or 2016 passed the $1 billion mark in terms of ticket sales. Now, needless to say, if you're selling $1 billion worth of tickets to your show, then that show is breathing rarefied air, so to speak. And there are only really, I think, 3 shows. I think it's Phantom of the Opera, Lion King, and Wicked are the only shows to break into that $1 billion bracket. So Stephen Schwartz clearly has made a profound impact through these works. But when Wicked was initially being workshopped, it received a very tepid response from the critics. And what he said was very telling. He said, the critics were divided in their opinion, but the audience was not. And that's, I think, something that we could say is true about Children of Eden as well. Critics may be divided about this work, but audiences and performers especially tend to be unified in a kind of very direct and unambiguous embrace of this musical. And we're going to talk about why that is. Obviously, we'll listen to it, we'll analyze the score, But whenever we talk about a musical, we also want to consider what this looks like when it's presented. The physical manifestation of musical theater involves costumes and staging and lighting and so many other tangible and intangible elements which need to be considered. So not only are we going to look at the score, but we're also going to be looking at a performance of arguably the blockbuster solo from the first act, a song that to this day remains one of the staple sort of show-off songs for Broadway tenors, a song called Lost in the Wilderness. So we'll get a chance to look at the score, but we'll also get a chance to look at what this might look like in a production. Now, it's Broadway in the Book of Genesis. The Book of Genesis, well, I think probably most people are familiar with the Book of Genesis. That is to say, it's the story of creation. And when it comes to the story of creation, we're talking about the very first words, right? Let there be. Well, actually, the first words that's the first song in the musical. But if you remember the first words, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And then the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. Well, some of you may recognize that little tune I sang, and that's not from Stephen Schwartz at all. In fact, that tune comes from a recitative written in 1798 by, of all people, if you can imagine it, Joseph Haydn. In other words, setting the story of Genesis to music is not something that started in 1991 with Stephen Schwartz's Children of Eden, really based on a book by John Caird. We should also include John Caird's name in this story. So setting the story of creation is something that is on the order of a time-honored tradition in various musical idioms. And again, I would suggest that the most famous one by a long shot is Haydn's Triphone, which is the German word for creation. And Haydn wrote that when he was really advanced in age. He was in his 60s, if you can imagine it, which was very old for someone born in the same year as George Washington, 1732. And yet it is considered by many to be not only Haydn's greatest vocal composition, but arguably one of his very best compositions. So perhaps there's something about the book of Genesis, the story of creation, the story of Adam and Eve, perhaps the story of Noah, the story of the flood, the post-diluvian world, which then takes us to Abraham and his descendants, right up until the Israelites going down to Egypt, which is really the end of the book of Genesis, or Bereshit in Hebrew, in the beginning of the book of Exodus. So maybe there's something about this story that is inherently compelling. Certainly that was the case for Haydn in the very late 18th century. And I think we'll see tonight that it's very much the case with Stephen Schwartz's Children of Eden. Now, on the surface, it may not seem that a story that chronicles what is in some ways a dry bit of the what some would call the Hebrew Bible, Christians might call it the Old Testament. And when I say it's dry, I mean that there's a lot of sort of genealogical exposition, and so begat so-and-so, and so begat so-and-so. There's a lot of interesting things in Genesis, but there are also some things that are perhaps not as interesting, or shall we say not as action-packed. So tonight, we're going to look at the structure of the musical, and we'll see that what Stephen Schwartz does, along with John Caird, again, he's responsible for the book, is that they're really going to make this a very compact story, which is not so much about doctrine. It's not so much about the antediluvian and post-diluvian worlds, as it is about universal themes that would resonate with any audience. And I think it's really important to stress that. If someone were to ask me, what is this musical about? Well, you could get into a dissertation on how it's about, the God created the heavens and the earth, and there was light, and there were all these creatures and flowers and water and humans eventually. In that, all that is true, but what we'll find tonight is that what Stephen Schwartz is interested in is the human aspects of Genesis. He's interested in what makes this story accessible and relatable to a contemporary audience. That's true in 1991, and it's true 30 years later for us here this evening. And we'll see there are a number of songs in the musical which are just as relevant, just as topical now as they ever have been. That is to say, as they were in Haydn's time, or before Haydn's time, or in the 1990s when the musical was premiered. Let's talk a bit about why the musical, well, I wouldn't say it flopped, but it received such a polarized and tepid reaction, especially from the critics. There are two reasons. One, 1991. What else happened in 1991? Well, of course, those of us who remember our history will recall the Gulf War. And that, of course, anytime you have a military conflict, that's going to have a very detrimental effect on the arts. Think about how World War II basically spelled the end of the swing era in jazz. Many of the swing era bands were forced to break up. They were big bands, sort of difficult to pay everybody and go on the road. Rubber shortages, which caused pauses and a hiatus in the recording industry. So we know that the scope of World War II, of course, was unprecedented and unparalleled. And I'm not suggesting that Desert Storm and the Gulf War were on the same order, but it is a factor here. Another factor here is the very large ensemble, the very large cast, which is typically involved in a performance of Children of Eden. Now, it can be done with a smaller cast, but it's really a musical that invites a huge, sweeping ensemble. In fact, if I were to do it at Naugatuck Valley, I would probably wait until a year where we had 25 or 30 or perhaps even more performers, which we typically, by the way, would have fewer than that, certainly. 20 would be a lot for us to have 20 capable performers able to handle the complex harmonic vocabulary of Stephen Schwartz. And that's going to be a challenge here with Children of Eden. In fact, when my students performed some of this music in a review class last fall, I think they would state with great clarity and candor that this is very difficult music, and certainly was the most difficult on that particular program. So we're talking about difficult music, a topic which on the surface might alienate those who are perhaps opposed to having a biblical content presented in musical theater. But again, as I stated, doctrine is not the core of this musical. It's about more universal themes of family love and maturation and bonding and relationships. And I think for that reason, it really works. And this is definitely a musical that people want to give a chance to, because there are many gems in this score. In fact, I would argue that the entire score is a treasure trove. And arguably, the dean of liberal arts at the college and I were talking about this about a year ago, and he's someone who's had his feet in the theater waters for decades. He and I agree that this is probably Stephen Schwartz's best work, and that may shock some of you to hear that opinion, because of course many of you are thinking of Wicked, which, as I mentioned earlier, is in that billion-dollar bracket along with Phantom and Lion King and nothing else, basically. Or Pippin and Godspell, which won many accolades in the 1970s, many Tony Awards, Drama Desk, Olivier, etc. Children of Eden did not win those awards, and yet here I am suggesting, at least in my opinion, and in the opinion of at least one other experienced listener and theater goer, this is perhaps Maestro Schwartz's best work. I'll share one last detail with you before we get into it. Last summer, some of you may have heard me tell this story, but last summer I was on a Zoom call as part of the Broadway Teachers Workshop with none other than Stephen Schwartz himself. He was the keynote speaker on the first day of the seminar. And he was asked during the Q&A, what's your favorite thing you've ever written? And he thought about it and he said, the finale of Children of Eden, a song called In the Beginning. Well, I think that's very telling. Some of you are perhaps wondering, why would the last song in the show be called In the Beginning? Of course, that's the first words of Genesis, right? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Well, as I mentioned, the very first song is actually called Let There Be, from the Hebrew. Vayehi, as in Vayehi, or let there be light. It's not just light. There's many other things where God says in Genesis, let there be, and then something else is stated. And we'll see how that spins out. But the fact that the musical ends with the word, with a number, with the chipit is, that is to say, the opening words are in the beginning, that's very telling. It tells us that there may be some kind of cyclical nature to this musical, that there may be something about it where the beginning is bound to the end in a very poignant and dramatic way. And I think that is the case, and I think it adds to the emotional impact that this musical has on us as listeners, even though we're essentially listening to a story which, whether you attribute it to Moses or as modern scholarship attributes it to later generations, is several thousand years old, right? It's somewhere 3,200 years old or perhaps 2,500 years old, but it's an old story. Rather than coming off as dusty history, as I mentioned, this comes off as incredibly topical, moving, enchanting, charming, compelling, and the music is absolutely infectious. So let's get right down to business. We're going to look at the score as we often do, and we'll listen to a few numbers from Act 1. I mentioned the opening number is called Let There Be. There are a couple of interesting things in the score here. I invite anyone who has questions about the score or anything else to please put it in the Q&A function, and I will be happy to get to it. Notice we start not on a chord, but on a dyad, a G flat against an E flat. And the singers sing in unison in the beginning. And they go up in this sort of, these notes, we might refer to this as sort of open intervals. B flat, E flat, B flat, outlining the octave, something simple and hollow. In a way, it's meant to mirror the opening words, right? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, but the earth was without form and void. So what the composer is going to do here is he's going to create a sound, which in the beginning at least, is going to give us a very weak sense of structure in terms of rhythm and periodicity. To put it another way, in the very beginning, it's going to be impossible to tell what key this is in, and it's going to be very hard to hear where the downbeats are and where the rhythmic accents are. And this is done on purpose, right? Because the world is yet to be formed. So how do you express this evocation of chaos? Well, here we have it. Notice they sing this figuration which outlines B flat, and it's immediately contradicted by the cello, which comes in and plays of all notes outlining B while they're holding those notes. So it's dissonant, it's chaotic, and that's exactly what it should be, because the world has yet to be formed. Now, who are the dramatic personae in this opening scene? Well, we know that in the book of Genesis, really, most of the stage time here in this adaptation has to be given to God, right? God is the only entity that exists in the beginning. God here is referred to in the score exclusively as Father. Remember, the name of the musical is Children of Eden, and therefore it sets up a relationship duality. We, human beings, are the children. God is the Father. Other things that happen in this opening number. Well, we're going to hear about the various days of creation. Now, they're not named as such, not, on the second day God created this, and on the third day. Instead, it just says, it's Father narrating in the first person. He's telling us what he's going to create, as if a painter or some artist were narrating their work in real time. The role of Father is traditionally sung by a very high baritone bordering on tenor. Otherwise, we don't have any characters yet, right? Father is the only one who's around here. The storytellers singing from perhaps some non-diachronic setting, that is to say, they're not the future, they're not the past, they're just narrating the story as if we were reading the book of Genesis ourselves, are the ones who sing and sort of accent and function as the chorus when Father is narrating. Musically, this style, as I mentioned, is chaotic and dissonant and unstable at first, but notice what happens when God says, "Let there be light." There's this shimmer of activity, complex chords with big upper structures, 11ths and 13ths, all sorts of interesting and complex sounds. And then all of a sudden, this shimmering synthesizer patch almost that sounds something like a celesta. It has this sort of glowing quality of a keyboard, but it's one that has more of a bell-like texture, or a bell-like timbre, I should say. So notice how the composer uses sound quality in addition to the actual chords and harmony and rhythm to evoke this really iconic opening scene, the first scene of creation. Here is "Let There Be" from the beginning of Children of Eden. Let me point out one thing here. This is an incredibly bold way to begin a musical. Obviously, it's consonant to some degree in the voices, but the orchestra doesn't exactly agree. And when they get to Earth, if we look very closely, and this may be a little bit of an inside baseball comment here, but if we look, we see that the basses are singing a C natural against a C sharp, an actual split octave. What that tells us is significant. And I alluded to it earlier, but it's worth spelling out. What it tells us is that there really is no key. I'm not suggesting this is completely atonal, but it has that quality. It's just a remarkably dissonant and pungent way to open. If anything, I would say this is polytonal. This is an F sharp against C major at the exact same time. The tritone chord relationship there being as distant as any two chords can be. And what it does is it makes us feel very unsettled. We're going to continue feeling that as the storytellers continue their narration. Without form, void, darkness. And notice when the basses sing darkness, the register shift on the word darkness. All right. So Father says he dreamt of a garden. Of course, this is the Garden of Eden. He sets about to build this dream. Obviously, this is a poetic interpretation of Genesis. As Pat mentioned in the opening remarks, this is not a canonical retelling of the book of Genesis. Rather, it's based on Genesis. And again, emphasizing the family themes. Now we get new music, a tempo change to cut time, a change to D flat major. And we're going to hear a rhythm that I would suggest sounds almost tribal, almost primitivistic. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I mean it in the same way Picasso would have meant it when he was incorporating masks into his paintings, such as Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. In the same way Stravinsky evokes tribal primitivism in The Rite of Spring. Music, which is supposed to evoke a sort of world that predates not only the modern world, but sort of predates religion. It predates paganism even. This is a primordial world. And the music here is simple in that way. You'll notice the pedal tone D flat. In other words, if you were to just listen, you'd hear the same tone retained in the bass over and over and over again. What that does is it's kind of the opposite of the beginning. Remember, we said the beginning was very unstable. Here, we get the opposite. We get this sense of comfort radiating from the music, but also through the marimba sound, we get this kind of tribal quality, which is suggestive of a world that's just been created. It's sort of untouched, primordial. Let's go ahead and listen to this next section. The opening number ends with that narration of what happens, what's the last thing that God creates, arguably the most important thing, not arguably, the most important thing. And God breathed into his children the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Some of you may be reminded of another musical setting of this story, Aaron Copland's. How many are familiar with Aaron Copland's In the Beginning? That's the name of a work for a cappella chorus with soloist. It's about 20 minutes long, and it ends with the creation of, well, us. And Copland's setting is a totally different harmonic language, of course, but it's that same line. And God breathed into his nostril the breath of life, and man became a living soul. In other words, this is what makes us different than everything else that God created. We have a living soul. Again, that's the interpretation of this line from Genesis. Man became a living soul. Now, in that last stretch where Father is gleefully describing this ultimate creation of his, he says that man can search for glory and worship him and think for himself. And that's going to be an important idea, a theme that comes up not just in Genesis, obviously, but also here in the musical, which is the concept of free will. We start with Adam and Eve in the garden. And, well, it's the Garden of Eden, so obviously things are going swimmingly for them. What could possibly go wrong? Well, we know what goes wrong. Eve is tempted by the snake, the serpent. Actually, the word nachash comes from the Hebrew mechoshesh, which means something like, could be interpreted as closer to a dragon. Nonetheless, snake is what's typically used, so I'll use that translation as well. The, um, the snake is going to tempt her to do what? To eat from the tree of knowledge, the forbidden tree. And when Eve eats from that tree, God says, why couldn't you just leave the tree alone? This is in the musical, I mean. And Eve has a very interesting response. Um, she says, why didn't you, you told me not to, but you didn't tell me why I shouldn't. And of course, God says, why did you have to be disobedient? And she said, that's not an answer. So we get this sort of back and forth between Eve, really, who spearheads this conflict, and Adam, who's kind of along for the ride in this version of the tale. So we're not going to listen to all of Act One. It's quite a long stretch of music. There's something like 20 numbers just in the first act. So instead, we'll look at a couple of numbers. I want to talk about how a composer might evoke this scene where Eve is being swayed, persuaded, seduced, one might even say, by the snake. And we get a song called In Pursuit of Excellence. And it starts with this creepy sort of melody, again, very dissonant, with an E natural against an E flat, another split octave. And it's got, of all instruments, if you can believe it, a recorder, that same instrument that most of you remember they either gave to you or your kids or your grandkids when they were in second grade. Here, Stephen Schwartz calls for the recorder to be played in the pit. He wants a flute player to double on recorder. Again, I think the idea here is to give the music a very sort of basic and primitive sound, and in this number at least, to give it a sense of creepiness. And the snake says, I've been watching you for a while now, my pretty little miss, and I've got to tell you this. So you see what he's doing is he's choosing words that end in a sort of hiss sound, a phoneme that approximates a snake's hiss. But the music is absolutely creepy, and then when it changes, it goes into stylistically what might be described as a 1930s jazz sound. That is to say, music evocative of the big band swing era, with a huge woodwind section. I think it calls for 3 clarinets in this number, which in most musicals, if you get 1 clarinet, that might be a lot. 2 would be almost unheard of. 3 is telling us quite a bit about how important timbre, what the Germans call Klangfarbe, sound color, is to this musical. Here is In Pursuit of Excellence, where Eve is being tempted by the snake to eat from the forbidden tree, the fruit from the forbidden tree. So here is In Pursuit of Excellence. We won't listen to the whole thing. We'll just listen to the exposition into the switch to the jazz idiom. This one, by the way, is an excellent number for dancers. If you've got a company that can dance, In Pursuit of Excellence is a number that gives them a chance to show off a bit. Did you notice that? Yum bum 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 bum. It has a creepy quality, but actually, this melody is something on the order of a stock device when one wants to evoke or elicit the quality of a taunt, a challenge, right? It's almost like na 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 na. Do you hear that with the minor third being emphasis there? Yum bum 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 bum. Listen to it again. The introduction. It's almost as if the snake, even before he begins singing, the snake is tempting and challenging and taunting Eve. Notice the tempo direction Schwartz gives us here. He calls it sleek and oily. How many of you have ever seen a tempo indication? Usually we see allegro, moderato, lento, whatever it is, but oily. Well, of course, he's trying to coax a very specific sound, not just from the pit orchestra, but also from the singers. And those clarinets certainly bring us back, do they not? The music here is unsettling, but also incredibly familiar. Notice what the snakes say. They say, functioning as a sort of a Greek chorus, why be a big fat fish in a small pond? In other words, Eden's great. The Garden of Eden's terrific. But don't you want to see what lies beyond? Well, that's exactly what's going to happen. Because they're going to get, Adam and Eve, are about to be expelled from the garden. Now, in this particular version of the tale, it's Eve who's expelled, because remember, Adam doesn't actually eat from the forbidden fruit. And yet, Father gives him a choice. This is about the midway point of Act 1. Father says, Adam, you are welcome to go follow Eve, but know that if you do, you can't come back. And if you stay, you can stay here in Eden where everything is perfect and it's rainbows and sunshine, and there's absolutely, you'll want for nothing. But Adam is torn. And this is a theme in Children of Eden. That is to say, the relationship between man and the divine and man with fellow man. In this case, Adam chooses Eve, and thus the two of them are expelled from the garden. Now we're going to listen to a very short number that Father sings about midway through Act 1, and then we'll take a look at the ending of Act 1 before we move to Act 2. In this number, it's called the Expulsion, and we're introduced. We've just heard the opening number where Father is beaming with pride and overflowing with hopefulness and the sort of joie de vivre that comes with, almost I used the analogy earlier, an artist creating something for which they have tremendous excitement. But in this number, we get Vengeful Father. And Vengeful Father's music comes back in Act 2. So we're going to listen to it here, and then we're going to listen for the concept of leitmotif, which some of you will remember is a Wagnerian concept that dates back to the middle of the 19th century and is associated with the works of Richard Wagner, whereby very particular musical cells are introduced that are associated with a character, an idea, or an event, or even an emotion. In this case, it's vengefulness. It's Father as the stern disciplinarian who is devastated by the rebellious, petulant behavior of his children. So here is a song from, again, about halfway through Act 1, a short number called The Expulsion. And we will go ahead and take a look at the score, and then this will be our last score example for Act 1. After this, we'll look at a stage presentation. Here's The Expulsion. Father starts, notice how low he's singing down in the bass register, and he's singing music, actually some of the leitmotifs we will have heard earlier, but he's going to get more and more agitated as the music becomes more and more agitated as Father does. Here is the music. And with an ominous crash of thunder, Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden. Notice the line, by the way, you'll toil in the fields, right? You'll work, sweat, bear your own children. And then it says, return to the clay. This is an interesting line because the next few scenes are going to take us out into what's described the wasteland, this sort of stinking wasteland of ash and brimstone, the opposite of the Garden of Eden, essentially. And it could refer to the clay that exists in this sort of stony, rocky wilderness, but really it's directly referring to the idea that, according to the Genesis account, man was created from clay, which is something that in the higher circles of biblical criticism is something that's debated hotly. What does that mean? Well, we won't get into it. Instead, we'll turn our attention to the descendants of Adam and Eve, namely their two sons, Cain and Abel. Now, there is a third son, Seth, who comes along later, but it's Cain and Abel who takes center stage as we make our way into the second part of Act 1. And initially, when we meet them, these are two brothers who get along very well. Abel is by far the more, I guess we would say, loyal and disciplined of the two, whereas Cain has what in German might be described as a certain degree of Wanderlust. He loves the idea of traveling and exploring and adventuring. He does not want to stay in this sort of stony pocket that the family has carved out for themselves. And when he finds a ring of stones, he becomes incredibly excited because to him it suggests that there are other people out there. And of course, Eve is very excited and Abel is very excited, but Adam is not excited. And then they determine that Adam knew about the stones and didn't tell them. And the family becomes shocked at this, but it's Cain who becomes incensed. That's going to happen later. What we're gonna first meet Cain. I'm going to show you this. When I mentioned it earlier, one of the big Broadway tenor belting show-off songs. It's called "Lost in the Wilderness." This is when we more or less first meet Cain and Abel is praying and thanking Father for all that they have, even though what they have is a pretty paltry, meager existence. That is to say, they live in this stony, stinking wasteland. And Cain wants to see what else is out there. And he basically says to Abel, we can't just live here forever. We have to see what's out there. And he sings this song, Lost in the Wilderness. We're going to take a look now at a production that features Ryan J. Driscoll in the role of Cain here. And you'll see in most productions, they'll dress the actors in what looks like tribal gear, that is to say, costumes that evoke this sort of pre-pagan world. And usually you get some sort of stony outcropping, and it's a rather Spartan set at this point in the musical because, again, they're in the wasteland. In fact, the number that precedes this song is called The Wasteland. So here is Lost in the Wilderness, and we'll actually watch this performance and we'll get to see what it looks like. We'll go over to YouTube. There we go. It starts out in what is almost like an operatic recitative, where Abel is saying, "Oh Father, for these gifts we have received, we thank you," in a kind of monotone chant. And then Cain starts to spin the music in new directions and to move us into new harmonic territory. And then the tempo picks up, and we get this, really classic 80s or 90s style, what we would sometimes call a rock power ballad. Let's go ahead and listen to it. A tour de force number for any tenor to show off his vocal range, especially in that ad-lib portion towards the end. There's a question in chat from Anonymous at 10D. One might ask why Father put the tree there in the first place. Actually, Cain raises that very point in this number. Remember, Abel says, it's God's will that we're here. And Cain reacts rather cynically by saying, is it God's will or have we all been conned? And as soon as he sings that line, we get this sort of very ambiguous, dissonant chord in the pit. So clearly, Cain is more a believer in the notion of free will, that, you can't just chalk everything up to some divine entity wanted it to be this way. We have to forge our own destiny. As he says at the end of the song, where our future lies a-borning. Borning is not a word we hear every day, but of course it means where our future is yet to be born, where our future is being hatched, forged, so to speak. The end of Act 1, of course, we know how the relationship between Cain and Abel develops and ultimately culminates. In the musical, Cain is so infuriated at his father for keeping the Ring of Stones a secret and for not wanting to explore the world that things turn violent. And when Abel attempts to intervene, it's Abel who's killed with a stone. And thus Cain is guilty of really the greatest crime that God's children or Father's children have committed. The eating of the forbidden fruit was one thing, but now one of his children, that is to say Father's children, has committed not only murder, but fratricide in an attempt to commit patricide, incidentally. So it's really an awful, heinous crime. And for this, Father becomes very agitated, and he sings a song where he decides that all the descendants of Cain shall bear a mark. And of course, this is the mark of Cain. That's going to be important in Act 2. Speaking of Act 2, let's get right to it. Act 2 begins hundreds of years after the death of Adam and Eve. That is to say, after mankind has propagated and filled the corners of the earth. We get a song in Act 2 called Generations, and it goes through some of the lineage, which I mentioned at the very beginning of the program. I suggested that lineage, that genealogy, can be rather dry if it's read as prose, but here set in the song Generations that opens Act 2, it's actually quite thrilling. Act 2 is going to focus on the flood, and we know that Father, I'll refer to him as that in this context, becomes so agitated, becomes so frustrated with his creations, namely mankind, that he decides to wipe them out. He's going to really teach them a lesson. That is to say, he's going to destroy his own creation. by making it, as he says in the musical, rain and rain and rain. And so we get a song which is going to detail the actions of those who survived um, the flood, and that, of course, would be Noah and his family. So if you were to summarize it and say, well, what's Act 1 about? Act 1 is about creation narrative. It's about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. It's about their defying, or Eve's defying, a father. It's about the expulsion from Eden, the propagation of the family through Adam and Eve to their descendants, Cain and Abel, and eventually Seth. It's about the murder of Abel by his brother Cain and the mark of Cain being placed upon his descendants. When we get to Act 2, Father is even more frustrated and even infuriated with his creations. He decides to wipe them out with a flood, but he's going to spare Noah and his family as the only righteous humans chosen to be spared this fate of drowning. And so he instructs Noah to build the ark. And that's really what most of the beginning of Act 2 is about, the building of the ark. And eventually, we're going to be introduced to Noah's family. So Noah, his wife, who is in the musical referred to simply as Mama Noah, that's fairly common, by the way, in biblical narratives. For example, in the story of Jephthah, in the book of Judges, which was set to music by Carissimi in the 17th century and Handel in the 18th century, the daughter of Jephthah is simply referred to in Latin as Filia Jephthah, the daughter of Jephthah. She doesn't get a name. So in this story, in this version, Noah's wife is simply referred to as Mama Noah. He has 3 sons, those of you remember, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Shem and Ham are married, and Japheth is not, and he's rejected the matches presented to him. The girl he wants is named Yonah. Yonah, by the way, in Hebrew means dove, Yonah. That's going to be significant in Act 2 because Yonah is going to be the one who, after she sneaks aboard the ark, is going to release the dove to go find land. At any rate, Japheth wants to marry Yonah, but he can't. Why? Because she bears the mark of Cain. She's a descendant of the race of Cain, and therefore he can't marry her. His father forbids it. And there's an analog here to be gleaned and to be appreciated, I think, by a contemporary audience, something that perhaps some of us listening to can relate to very closely. The idea that when you bring home that person with whom you feel an amorous connection, one is concerned about how one's family will react to he or she and whether they'll accept that person or not. In this case, Yonah is rejected because she bears the mark of Cain. And yet, Noah is kind to her, he's gentle to her, and he explains to her in this next number that first he invites her to dinner to sit among them. But then, of course, he tells her that she cannot come on the ark because if she did, he would be defying father's orders. So we get this charming number where Yonah is sort of brought into the family for one last dinner before Noah takes her aside and tells her that he cannot let her aboard the ark. Well, she's going to be smuggled aboard the ark at any rate and eventually becomes part of the family. But this next number, I think, is a great example of sort of the family dynamics of really any family, not just this, not antediluvian, not post-diluvian. One might say this diluvian family. That a diluvian, of course, means of or pertaining to the flood. So here's a piece of 8 from Children of Eden. Starts with this anthemic section, which is sung by the full company. Again, the storytellers, as they're referred to, are narrating here. Piece of 8. And I see we have a couple of questions, which we'll get to after this. So here is this number. And no. Yonah is, of course, not allowed onto the ark, and she sings a song called Stranger to the Rain, in which she says, I am not a stranger to the rain. In other words, this is not the first time I've been down on my luck as a member of the race of Cain. But as we know, she's going to be saved by Japheth. He's going to come and smuggle her aboard. And this is going to lead to some friction in the family. Before we get to this last chapter and listen to our last number, we're going to let me just look at the chat. Great. Ethan asks, Yeah, about the staging in the scene we watched with Cain and Abel. You know, typically there is some very, very stock stage direction here. That is to say, Abel is typically on his knees. Anyone who's in a sort of bowed in prayer is going to be in that sort of stance. But no, I don't think so. And that I don't think anyone's following a particular set of blocking or choreography here. It's not like doing Pippin, for example, which we talked about, with the classic Bob Fosse staging from the 1972 version. In this case, there is no canonical choreography to this musical. Good question. All right. Now, remember I told you what happens when father is angry. We get this music, which is very threatening and ominous. And after Yona sings "Stranger to the Rain," Japheth comes out and sings a duet with her. It's a very tender, poignant duet. I recommend you check it out. It's called "In Whatever Time We Have," where they decide that they're going to be together no matter what. And then it's time for the rain to start pouring, and so we get the flood. Now remember, this is like 20 numbers after the expulsion from Eden. But the fact that Stephen Schwartz uses the same music is very telling. What he's telling us is that Father is angry here. Here is the flood, a very short number, and it's going to take us into our very last stretch. We have one more listening excerpt after this, and it's a long one. This one's very short. So we'll listen to the flood, and then we'll skip to the last number and wrap it up. So notice we're told we want some percussion effects for thunder, some very low bass drum and toms, and they're usually the technical side of things. They're going to pipe in some thunder and effects to make it really feel like there is an absolutely a tumultuous storm brewing. Here is the flood. Now that's not the end of the number, but it's for some of you will connect the dots. That's the exact same music transposed down or transposed up a half step, I think, from where we heard it in Act One. In other words, the leitmotif, we're just getting a sense of it tonight in this very short program, but it's very, very audible here in the scene where Adam and Eve are expelled from Eden, and in the scene where Father unleashes the flood to blot out the earth, as he says, we get the same music, and that's a very powerful effect. Remember, in musical theater, the reprise, or in this case, the use of leitmotif, is a very powerful device because when you kindle someone's sonic memories, you're taking them back, you're connecting the story, you're connecting, maybe you're demonstrating the growth or the maturation of a particular relationship or character, or in this case, we're using it to evoke a very stern and vengeful face of the father who is so jolly and so loving and so caring through most of the musical. Well, what happens next? The family discovers Yona. Remember I said they smuggled her aboard? And in this version of the story, the reaction of Japheth's brothers, Ham and Shem, is a very violent one. They think that the reason it hasn't stopped raining, they sing a number called "What Is He Waiting For?", where the family begins to bicker and argue. Why does it keep raining? He saved us for what? Why did he tell us to build this ark if it's just going to rain and rain and rain? We're going to die here anyway. And so when they discover Yona, they think, this is it. She's brought this curse upon us. And then when just as it's looking very, very hopeless, very forlorn, they realize that land must be near because of Yona's dove. And so we're now approaching the very end of the musical. Before it ends, we get a solo from Mama Noah. The role, by the way, is double cast so that the actress who sings the role of Mama Noah is also Eve in Act One. It's a huge role. In some community theaters, they don't double cast because it allows you to spread the burden a little bit so that not, for example, in the case of Mama Noah, you get two actresses, it's half as much work. It's much more manageable for the actresses, especially for young actresses. And Mama Noah sings a gospel number. It's called "Ain't It Good?" And this is a sort of a very upbeat and sort of cheeky musical style to choose for this moment of absolute ebullient celebration. And now we've celebrated, what's left to do? They're about to land the ark. That is to say, they're back on solid ground for the first time since the flood began. And what's left to do? Well, the answer is to repopulate the earth, and they're the only ones um, on the ark. They're the only survivors of the flood. And so there is this sense of a new beginning, of starting over, wiping the slate clean. And before we hear this number, we get a final scene where Mama Noah asks Noah. Now remember, Noah's been in dialogue with God. God's the one who told him to build the ark, right? And in this incredibly tender and poignant scene, um, Mama Noah says to Adam, she says, well, have you tried to speak to him? That is to say, to speak to Father. And Noah says, I've tried, but he won't answer. And this is sort of bringing us into, again, as I said, a very topical theme, one that exists as much in 1991 as it does today, as it does hundreds of years ago, or even thousands of years ago. Um, the idea that we believe, and when I say we, I mean the majority of the world, I think if I had the statistics, I would say several billion, maybe 4 billion or something like that, or maybe more. People believe in a creator, in a deity, with whom nobody has conversed with since, um, well, let's just say at least since the time of Moses, right? Or perhaps after that. But we're talking about a couple of millennia. And so Noah comes to a realization that man now has, in this post-diluvian world, that is, say, after the flood, man now has the agency to make decisions for his or herself, and that God will no longer interfere directly in the comings and goings of mankind. And they're entering this sort of this new phase, this new ethos, this new world where they have the autonomy to forge their own destinies. And it's a very powerful realization. And with this understanding that they've had free will all along, in other words, going back to Eve and the forbidden fruit, and Cain and the fratricide of Abel, the idea of free will is a concept that comes up through the musical, and it's sort of resolved in this last number. And the text here is, I think, among the finest lyrics that Stephen Schwartz ever wrote. And he's a prolific lyricist. Those of you who know his work know that he wrote the lyrics and the music to, just to name a few of those works, Pippin and Godspell and Wicked. But I would suggest that it's here in the finale of Children of Eden where he's written his finest poetry, his finest prose. We'll look at the text because we're going to look at the score. But essentially, the words here are in the beginning. That's the refrain we keep coming back to. And as I mentioned earlier in the program, that's an interesting way to end the musical, right? Because in the beginning, those are some of in fact, they are the opening words of the book of Genesis. So Schwartz is choosing to end here, the last numbers, the 43rd number in the score, if you can believe it, an over 400-page score. He's choosing to end with the first words of Genesis. So we're bringing things full circle. And speaking of full circle, these are the first words we hear when Japheth and Jonah step off the ark. They say, "This step is once again our first. We set our feet upon a virgin land. We hold the promise of the earth in our hands." Um, they sing of things that allude to events that have happened in the musical. They sing of things that are yet to transpire. But again, it doesn't read as dusty, archaic history. It reads as something incredibly relevant and incredibly moving. The instrumentation here is also very special. Schwartz is going to bring in the distinct timbre of the harp. We talked earlier about some other instruments that were featured. Here, I would suggest that the harp and especially the piano at its extremes, at the low and high end of the piano, is going to really be something to listen for as we make our way through. The last thing I want to call your attention to as we listen is the incredible complexity of the harmony in this last number. Typically in choral music, and that could mean in a standard choir or chorus, or even in musical theater, harmony is typically split into 3 or 4 parts, 4 being the standard. Here, Stephen Schwartz is going to ask the choir to split into, by the end, something like 8 or 9 parts. He wants this huge sweeping sound, and as I mentioned earlier, that's one of the, I would say, limitations of doing Children of Eden, is that you really want a very big ensemble to do this musical. And if you're talking about an equity show where everyone's got to get paid, it makes it sort of cost prohibitive if the outcome and the favorable reception is not guaranteed. And I think that's one of the reasons why the show had such an ephemeral presence on stage in 1991 when it premiered. Nonetheless, we're going to listen to the ending of the musical. And remember, this is the song that Maestro Schwartz last summer in the Broadway Teachers Workshop suggested, at least at that particular moment in July of 2020, was his favorite thing he'd ever written. So we know we're in for something special. I've sort of loaded the deck, but here we have it. In the beginning, the last number of Children of Eden. Listen for the simplicity of the beginning, which is going to develop into more and more complex ideas. Again, simplicity because they're just landing the arc and they're starting over, so it has to be simple. It starts with that same interval of B flat, E flat, B flat, which is the very same notes we hear at the very opening of the musical when they sing, in the beginning, right? Yum, bum, bum, ba, dum. If we go back to page 1, this is page 1, right? In the beginning, those are the notes. Now we look at the last number 43 on page 381, and it's the same thing. This step is, so we have this outlining of the octave, again, bringing things full circle in a very powerful way. Here's in the beginning. You can see here some of that complexity I mentioned. Just look at how many different notes he wants from the choir, all the way down to G flat 2 in the bass register, all the way up to D flat 6 at the tippity top of the soprano register. Someone wrote in chat that this sounds like a hymn. You're absolutely right. It does sound like a hymn. The reason we would say that is because it's written in what's called a homophonic style. Homophonic from the Greek meaning same sounding. What that refers to specifically is the rhythm, that the singers are almost always singing at the same time. So they're singing in very dense harmony, sometimes very complex and changing harmony, but always lined up rhythmically. And it does give the music this powerful anthemic congregational sort of quality, as do the words, right? I love the words at the end here when they sing, Children of Eden, grant us your pardon. This is sort of the parents asking forgiveness from the children, not necessarily father speaking to the children, but the parents themselves. That is to say, Adam and Eve talking to Cain and Abel and Seth, and them talking to their descendants, and Noah talking to his sons. Grant us your pardon. All that we leave to you is the unknown. This is a sort of universal theme I think anyone could relate to. The idea, I mean, I've got news for us, folks. Every one of us has parents. And the idea that our parents, all that they can't help us past a certain point. They can't shape our destinies past a certain point. Or we have to make our lives for ourselves. And this is something that's hinted at in this number, and it's addressed throughout the musical, and it's very, very powerful. The line where they sing, our hands can choose to our hands can choose to drop the knife. Our hearts can choose to stop the hating. That's as topical now as it's ever been. I think something that people would really resonate with as they listen to it here. Let's go ahead and check the Q&A section. Great question. Someone asks, is this the Broadway cast and who sings Father? There is a very interesting history to Children of Eden in terms of its recording history. And it's a history that is indicative of the rocky start that it got. This is not the Broadway company. This is actually a version that was done, I believe, in 1997, I think, at the Paper Mill Playhouse in New Jersey. And the soloists, I believe, William Solo played Father, Adrian Zemed played Adam, was double cast as Noah, Stephanie Mills was Mama Noah / Eve, and then famously, Darius DeHaas played the role of Cain in Act 1. And I say famously because as high as that music is already written with G's and A's and even a B4 written, Darius DeHaas sang the whole thing a whole step higher than it's written. He asked for it to be transposed to the key of A major, which is absolutely nuts. But no, it's the Paper Mill Playhouse, and this recording was actually financed and overseen by Stephen Schwartz himself, I suppose because he felt jilted to some degree that he hadn't gotten a proper recording from the original cast. Barbara says, thank you, I adore this show. Barbara, I am absolutely right there with you. This is one of my favorite musicals, and it's not something that I can see us doing anytime soon at the college. But as soon as we have, we're rebuilding now to a degree after COVID, and as soon as we have our personnel back and our numbers start to swell once more, I can certainly see us doing this. As I said, it's a favorite for community theaters. Barbara says, my favorite is when father says, I thought having children would keep me young, but you're making me old. So I set you free. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great line. Um, Sharon says, thank you, Gil. You're welcome. Very poignant and powerful. And this is actually my first time hearing this, so much relevance. Absolutely. Thank you. I'm so glad you liked it. And it's always a roll of the dice, Sharon, right? Sometimes I choose works that are off the beaten path, and one never knows how the audience will react to such content. I think sometimes people, to use an expression in show business, they want us to play the hits. But oftentimes, I think we're able to tap into a real hidden gem, Pat. That's how we described it, right? This is one of the overlooked jewels in the treasure trove of the musical theater canon.
Gil, this has been fascinating. Now I want to go back and really listen to all 43 songs. But before I go and do that, I'd like you to tell everyone about your next appearance in July.
I am so thrilled to share with you that thanks to the awesome Darien Library, the always awesome Darien Library, we will be returning to live programming. We're going to be outdoors enjoying the summer sun in July, on July 18th at 5 p.m. And this is not going to be any old program. I am inviting 4 of my seasoned musical theater Broadway performers, and we are going to set up outside in that beautiful courtyard outside the library near the fountain. We're going to have a keyboard, some microphones and amplifiers, and we are going to present selections from various musicals for you. We'll have 4 singers singing solos, duets, and ensemble numbers for you, including, by the way, Pat, music from Children of Eden. So I hope our great community members will join us on July 15th, and we're going to get the word out and continue to spread the word, because I know, like you and like me, so many of our community members are just over the moon that we are returning to an in-person musical presentation.
And that was July 18th.
July
Sunday
18th,
at 5.
Sunday at 5. Come join us, and we're going to have hopefully beautiful weather and certainly beautiful music in a beautiful location outside of the inspiring Darien Library, which has done so much to keep learning and enrichment and mental nourishment alive and well during this very difficult period. But now that we're sort of coming out and the light is at the end of the tunnel, we will really embrace one another, even if it's still from a distance. We'll embrace one another in this incredible opportunity that the library is affording us.
Thank you, Gil. Wonderful evening.
It's my pleasure, Pat. We'll see you and the residents in person, hopefully the members of our great community, on July 18th. So
Terrific.
I can't wait. Until then, my friends, stay well.
You too.